There are moments in life that do not echo. They simply settle inside you and change everything you once believed. I spent 25 years raising a boy who was not mine by blood, but was mine in every other way that mattered. His name was Liam. From the moment he learned to walk, my hands were the ones he reached for. When he cried through sleepless nights of fever, it was my shoulder he held on to. His real father vanished before he could even form the word Dad. I never asked where or why. I just stepped into the space that man left behind and made it my purpose to fill it. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and built a life around his laughter because I believed love was not written in DNA but proven through presence. Every scraped knee, every new pair of shoes, every long night of worry. I was there. Before I go further, I want to say this. If you are watching right now, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps more people hear stories like mine. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I always wonder which corner of the world these words reach. I remember sitting outside the principal's office after one of Liam's fights, listening to teachers whisper, "He is lucky to have you, Mr. Walker." I would nod quietly, tired but proud. Liam would come out, embarrassed, his eyes avoiding mine, but I always put a hand on his shoulder and said, "It is all right. We will fix it." He never once called me stepfather. He called me Dad. Every time he said that word, it erased the pain of long hours, the exhaustion of endless days, and the burden of bills I could barely pay. It made every sacrifice worth something. When Grace, his mother, passed away, the bond between us became the only thing that kept me alive. We sat together at her funeral, my hand resting on his back while he cried into his palms. That day, I thought we had become more than father and son. We were two men tied by the same loss, holding on to the same fragile thread of family. Years went by, and Liam began to change. He found work, started dressing better, talking faster, living larger. I watched from the background, quietly proud. I gave him the best room, the biggest plate, the last bit of warmth from every fire. That is what fathers do. They give until there's nothing left to give. And I gave. I gave my time, my health, my savings, and my dreams. I gave everything I had so that he could live without fear. I thought he saw it. I thought he felt it. But as he grew older, the gratitude faded. The smiles became sighs, and the sighs turned to silence. He started calling me Thomas instead of Dad. At first, I told myself it was just a phase, a harmless sign of growing up. But deep inside, I knew something was slipping away. Love was retreating slowly, like warmth leaving a dying fire. Still, I stayed. Through his pride, his distance, and his sharp words, I stayed. Because love, I believed, does not abandon its post. I thought one day he would understand, that he would look back and realize everything he had became possible because of me. Then came that evening. There was no argument, no warning, only the quiet clinking of forks and the soft murmur of the television in the next room. I had cooked his favorite dinner, roasted chicken with rosemary and mashed potatoes with butter, just like Grace used to make. My hands ached, my knees hurt, but I did it anyway. When he came home, he smelled of expensive cologne and fatigue. He sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, answering my questions with half-hearted nods. I smiled anyway because fathers always try. Then he looked up. His eyes met mine, cold, distant, and unfamiliar. He put down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and said it. Not in anger, not even in frustration, but with calm finality. "You are not my real father. The sound of the television faded away. The clock on the wall seemed to stop. My hand trembled against the table, and the food lost its warmth. I could not speak. The air felt heavier, and all I could do was stare at him, at this man I had raised, at this stranger sitting across from me. Those 5 words did not echo. They did not sting right away. They just landed and stayed there, heavy and permanent. And in that silence, I realized the truth I had been avoiding for years. I had spent half my life building love with my bare hands, only to discover that love without respect collapses as easily as silence falls. Across the table sat the boy I once called my son, and I could no longer recognize him. I stayed seated long after he left the room, staring at the empty chair he had abandoned. The food was still warm, but everything else had gone cold. The house that once held laughter now felt like a hollow shell filled with echoes that did not belong to me anymore. The walls that used to make me proud now pressed closer, heavy with silence. I could still hear his words in my head, quiet but sharp. "You are not my real father." It was strange how simple sentences could carry so much finality. They did not shout. They did not echo. They just ended something that had taken decades to build. For a while, I sat perfectly still, afraid that if I moved, the air around me might shatter. My hands rested on the table, trembling slightly. The smell of rosemary still hung in the air, but it was no longer comforting. It was mocking. Every corner of that room had a memory attached to it, the nights of laughter, the small talks about dreams, the dinners when Grace used to hum softly while setting the table. All those memories suddenly felt like ghosts crowding around me, watching as love fell apart in silence. When I finally stood up, the chair scraped against the floor with a sound that felt louder than any scream. I walked into the living room, where photographs of our lives lined the walls. Liam as a child on my shoulders, his small hands gripping my hair. Liam holding his first bicycle. Liam smiling in his graduation gown. I stopped in front of one photo where he stood between me and Grace, his arms wrapped around both of us, his smile pure and bright. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, older now, smaller somehow, as if the light had gone out. I pressed my hand against the frame, and the cold glass made me shiver. I whispered to the empty room. I was there, every single day. My voice cracked halfway through the words. There was no one to hear it, but I said it anyway. Sometimes we speak not to be heard, but to remind ourselves that we are still capable of sound. I turned toward the hallway and noticed the faint light spilling from under Liam's door. For a moment, I thought of knocking, of asking why, of demanding an explanation. But then I stopped. What could he say? What apology could ever erase what he had already taken back with that sentence? So instead, I walked past his room and into mine. The bed looked too large, the room too quiet. I sat at the edge of it, staring at the faint pattern on the wallpaper. I tried to remember the boy who once asked me to tell him stories before bed, who used to run to me when thunder scared him. I tried to see him in the man who had just spoken those words, but I could not. Somewhere along the line, that boy had disappeared, replaced by someone colder, someone who had forgotten where he came from. The clock on the wall ticked louder as the night deepened. I found myself counting the seconds, each one pulling me further away from the life I thought I knew. I remembered the nights when I had worked late shifts, my hands raw and cracked, coming home to find him asleep on the couch, waiting for me. I remembered how he used to hug me without reason, the kind of affection that comes only from children who still believe love is unbreakable. Those moments replayed in my mind like scenes from another man's life. They used to bring warmth, Now they burned. There are kinds of pain that have no sound, no shape, no scream. They just sit behind your ribs and breathe with you. That was the kind of pain I felt that night. I did not cry. The tears did not come. They had no place to go. Instead, I sat still, feeling every breath as a reminder of what was gone. The house seemed to grow colder by the hour. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a memory leaving. When midnight came, I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The plates were still on the table. His untouched glass of water reflected the dim light like a mirror, showing me a face I barely recognized. I picked up his plate and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was such a simple object, yet it carried so much history. The countless meals I had served, the nights of laughter that had once filled this same room. I placed it down gently, afraid the sound might wake something inside me that I was not ready to face. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street was quiet. Only the soft hum of distant traffic and the faint flicker of streetlights on the wet pavement. Somewhere in that stillness, I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body. It was the soul finally realizing it has given all it can give. I thought about waking Liam, about trying to talk him, but what would be the point? Words had already failed. Love had already broken. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the small pieces of a life that had been built with years of devotion. Everything felt foreign now. Everything felt temporary. I reached the hallway mirror and paused. My reflection stared back at me, older than I remembered, eyes sunken from years of trying to keep a family whole. I whispered, "You did your best," though the words sounded hollow even to me. I could not escape the truth that echoed silently between my ribs. I had given my life to someone who had already stopped remembering me. I went back to my bed, but did not lie down. I sat there until dawn began to crawl across the walls. The first light of morning touched the room in a pale shade of gold, soft and uncaring. And in that quiet light, I understood something I had avoided for years. Love, when given to the wrong heart, becomes a slow kind of grief. I sat in that chair long after the sun came up, feeling the ache of those words like a weight pressing into my chest. The light coming through the window did not feel like morning anymore. It felt like exposure, like it was showing me everything I had refused to see. The silence in the house was thick, and for the first time, it sounded unfamiliar. It was not the calm quiet of home. It was the stillness of something that had already ended. I looked around at the walls, at the framed photographs, at the furniture I had repaired so many times over the years. And I saw how much of myself was woven into every inch of this place. Every corner carried a story. Every nail in the wall held a memory. And yet, I no longer belonged to any of it. I walked into the hallway and stopped outside Liam's room. The door was closed, but light slipped through the gap beneath it. I could hear him moving around, maybe getting ready for work, maybe pretending that last night never happened. I wanted to open that door. I wanted to ask him if he understood what his words had done. But then I thought about the tone in his voice, the way he had said it. Not in anger, not in confusion, but in calm certainty. There was no misunderstanding. He had meant it. That was enough to stop me from reaching for the handle. Some doors, once closed, are better left untouched. I went into the living room instead and stood by the window. Outside, the street was waking up. Cars passed slowly. People walked dogs. A newspaper landed on the front step. Life was moving forward as if nothing had happened. But inside this house, time had stopped. I thought about the years that had led here. I remembered Liam's first day of school, how he had held my hand so tightly that morning because he was afraid to let go. I remembered the nights when I worked through the rain, coming home soaked and tired, but still smiling when I saw his face. I remembered the way Grace used to laugh softly while she watched the two of us, her eyes filled with quiet pride. That life felt so close and yet so far away, like looking at a photograph through glass. I walked to the shelf by the fireplace and picked up one of the framed pictures. It was from a summer long ago. Liam sitting on my shoulders at the fair, his little hands gripping my hair while we both laughed at something I cannot even remember now. I stared at that picture for a long time. The smile on his face was pure, free of the distance that would one day replace it. I wondered when exactly that boy had disappeared. When did love turn into indifference? When did presence become invisible? I placed the photo back gently and sat down on the couch. My body felt heavier than it should have, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. I tried to make sense of everything, but there was no logic left to find. I had given my entire life to a version of family that existed only because I refused to let it fall apart. But now, even the illusion had crumbled. I realized then that I had been holding on to something that no longer existed. Love cannot survive on memory alone. It needs respect, and once that is gone, all that remains is habit. I closed my eyes and thought of Grace. I could almost hear her voice again, gentle and clear, the way it was when she used to warn me about the dangers of giving too much. "Thomas," she once said, "you have a heart that refuses to stop trying, even when it is breaking." At the time, I smiled and told her that love was supposed to hurt sometimes. Now, years later, I understood what she had really meant. There is a difference between loving someone and losing yourself in the process. When I opened my eyes, the room seemed sharper, clearer, like I was seeing it for the first time without love softening the edges. The couch where Liam used to fall asleep while watching cartoons, the wall where Grace had hung her favorite painting, the table that had hosted birthdays and dinners. All of it was still here, but it no longer felt like mine. It was as though I had been living in someone else's story, waiting for a part that had already been written out. I stood and walked into my study, the small room at the back of the house where I kept my records, bills, and papers. The air in there smelled faintly of dust and old wood. I opened the drawer where I kept everything that mattered: the house deed, bank documents, receipts from the years of work that had built this home. My name was printed on every page, proof of the life I had constructed with my own hands. I ran my fingers across the title deed and realized something that took the air out of me. Every comfort Liam had ever known, every roof, every meal, every security, had come from the same hands he had rejected. The truth hit me in a way that was almost peaceful. I had spent my entire life believing that love meant holding on. But maybe love, at least the honest kind, sometimes meant letting go. Perhaps real love was not about forcing someone to see your worth, but knowing when it is time to walk away. I had nothing left to prove. I stood at the desk, looking at the papers scattered in front of me. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I reached for the pen that had been sitting in its holder for years. It was a simple black pen, nothing special. But as I picked it up, it felt heavier than I remembered. My fingers tightened around it, and I realized what I was about to do. This pen had built our life together. It had signed school forms, bank loans, contracts, and every small promise that turned this house into a home. Now it would be used to end it. I took a deep breath and whispered to the quiet room, "It is time." The sound of my own voice startled me. It felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. The decision had been sitting in my chest for hours, maybe days, waiting to be spoken aloud. Now that it was out, everything around me seemed to still. I stood there in that small study, surrounded by the papers that told the story of my life. And I knew what needed to be done. This house, this space, this life that I had built with my own hands, no longer felt like home. It had become a monument to something that no longer existed. I spent the next few minutes gathering documents, stacking them neatly on the desk. The deed to the house, the insurance records, the old bank statements, all the proof of a life spent giving. My name appeared everywhere, on every signature line, every seal, every date. Years of sweat and sacrifice written in ink. And now, that same ink would erase me. I folded the papers carefully, placed them into a worn leather folder, and stood there for a moment, staring at it. The weight of that folder felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. It contained everything that had once defined me, and soon it would belong to someone else. The morning light had shifted by the time I left the room. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I walked through the hallway, past Liam's closed door. I could hear him moving around inside, humming softly, perhaps getting ready to leave for work. I paused for a moment outside his door, listening. There was no hesitation in his movements, no trace of the conversation that had destroyed everything the night before. It was just another morning for him. For me, it was the last one. I turned away and walked out to the porch. The air outside was cool, the kind that carries the faint scent of rain. I sat on the front steps and looked at the street I had lived on for so many years. I watched the neighbors leaving their homes, children rushing to catch, the school bus, dogs barking at passing cars. Everything looked the same. And yet, it all felt distant. I realized that the world never pauses for heartbreak. It moves forward, unbothered by the silence left behind. That realization did not hurt as much as I thought it would. If anything, it made my decision feel clearer. By late morning, I found myself standing outside the lawyer's office. It was a modest building on a quiet street, one I had visited many times before when I first bought the house. I remembered walking through those doors with Grace by my side, holding her hand as we signed the papers that marked the beginning of our life together. The memory stung, but I let it come. Pain is often the only proof that something once mattered. I pushed the door open, and the soft chime of the bell above it broke the silence. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. How can we help you today?" she asked. Her voice was kind, familiar. I had been there so many times over the years. I returned the smile, though mine felt heavier. "I need to see Mr. Hale," I said. Within a few minutes, I was sitting in the same chair I had occupied 2 decades ago, back when this building represented new beginnings. Now it stood as the place where I would end one. When Mr. Hale entered, his expression was warm but cautious. He had known me for years, had watched Liam grow up through the stories I told him during past visits. "Thomas," he greeted, shaking my hand firmly. "It's been a long time. What brings you in today?" His voice carried a trace of concern, as if he already knew this was not a social visit. I took a breath and handed him the folder. "I want to sell the house," I said quietly. He blinked, taken aback. "Sell it? Are you sure? You have lived there for most of your life." I nodded. "I am sure." He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment, perhaps waiting for an explanation. But I had none to give. Some decisions do not need reasons. They just need peace. After a moment, he nodded slowly and began sorting through the papers. "We can have everything prepared within a few days," he said gently. "You will need to sign a few forms, and I can handle the rest." I watched him shuffle through the pages, his hands careful and deliberate. The sound of paper sliding against paper filled the room. As I waited, I let my gaze wander around the office. The same framed certificates hung on the wall. The same clock ticked softly above the door. Nothing had changed, yet everything inside me had. I remembered sitting there all those years ago with Grace. How full of hope we had been, how sure we were that this house would be the foundation of our family's happiness. Now, I was alone in the same chair, preparing to undo it all. I found a strange comfort in that symmetry. Life, it seemed, had a quiet way of closing its own circles. When Mr. Hale returned with the documents, he placed them gently in front of me. "If you are ready, sign here," he said. I looked down at the lines, each one waiting for my name. The pen felt cold in my hand. For a moment I hesitated, staring at the paper, thinking of everything that had happened within those walls. The laughter, the arguments, the long nights of worry, the birthdays, the sound of Grace's laughter echoing through the kitchen, the first time Liam called me Dad. It all passed before me like a film, flickering in silence. Then I lowered the pen to the page. As the ink began to flow, I felt something shift inside me. It was not relief, not regret, just release. Years of weight seemed to lift, replaced by a stillness that I'd never felt before. I signed each page carefully, my hand steady, my heart strangely calm. When I finished, I placed the pen down and pushed the papers toward him. "It is done," I said. Mr. Hale looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will take care of everything," he said softly. "Do you want to know who the buyer is?" I shook my head. "No, it does not matter." He gathered the papers, stamped them, sealed them, and placed them into a file. The sound of the stamp echoed softly in the quiet room, final and irreversible. I stood, shook his hand, and thanked him. My voice sounded calm, but my chest felt hollow. I stepped outside, and the sunlight hit my face. For the first time in years, I did not look back at the building behind me. I just walked forward, feeling the ground under my feet, feeling the world move again. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. I had given everything I had to that house, that family, that life. Now it belonged to someone else. The home that once defined me was gone, and in its absence, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. I walked for a long time that day, letting the air move through me, feeling lighter with every step. There was no celebration, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of release. The papers were signed, the deal complete. The house that had once been filled with laughter, arguments, and promises was no longer mine. By the time I returned to the street where I had lived for most of my life, I did not even slow down. The windows looked the same, the garden still trimmed, but everything beyond those walls had already changed. I had become a ghost in my own story, and that felt right. That night, I packed what little I cared to keep, a few shirts, my old watch, Grace's photograph, and a small journal. The rest I left behind. I did not write a note. There was nothing left to say. Words had already failed. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The world outside was quiet and gray. I stood by the window, watching the first light touch the rooftops, and for the first time in decades, I felt no obligation to stay. I walked through each room one last time, touching the walls as though I were saying goodbye to something that had already forgotten me. Then I closed the front door behind me and left the key on the porch rail, exactly where Liam would find it. I did not stay to see what happened next. Some endings are better unseen. By the time the real estate agent arrived to prepare for the handover, I was already miles away, sitting in a small cafe near the train station. My suitcase was beside me, my coat folded neatly across the chair. The city outside the window looked washed in pale sunlight, the kind of light that makes everything seem softer than it really is. I sipped my coffee slowly and watched strangers pass, their lives unfolding without knowing mine had just ended one chapter and begun another. I imagined the scene back at the house. Liam arriving later that morning, his usual arrogance still intact, his mind already filled with work calls or plans with friends. He would pull into the driveway, not noticing the small "for sale" sign that had been taken down just hours earlier. He would walk up to the front door, humming faintly, his keys jangling in his hand, unaware that they no longer matched the locks. He would push the door open and step into what he believed was still his home. At first, he would probably think he had walked into the wrong house. The smell would be different, the air unfamiliar. Then he would see them, strangers walking through the living room, their voices calm, detached, professional. The real estate team finishing their inspection. Maybe a new owner standing beside them, looking around with the polite satisfaction of someone admiring what they had just bought. I pictured his confusion as he called out my name once, maybe twice, expecting me to answer from the kitchen like always. But the only reply would be silence. He would check the rooms, open the closet, glance at the walls where our photographs used to hang. The one of Grace smiling on the porch, the one of him as a child on my shoulders, gone. The shelves empty, the drawers cleared. Every trace of our life together erased, except for faint outlines where the frames had been. He would call my name again, louder this time, and still there would be no sound. Then the panic would come. The realization would crash over him slowly, then all at once. He would search for his things, but they would not be there. He would look at the strangers moving through his home, the woman holding a clipboard, the man pointing out details about lighting and space. And when he finally demanded to know what was happening, one of them would say it gently, perhaps even kindly. "The house has been sold, sir." He would laugh at first, the kind of nervous laugh people make when their world begins to tilt. "Sold?" he would repeat, waiting for someone to correct them. But there would be no correction. There would only be silence. And then the truth would arrive, in the form of paperwork, stamped and signed, my name printed neatly at the bottom. I imagined the look on his face at that moment, the disbelief, the sting of understanding, the quiet horror that comes when you realize that everything you thought was yours never truly was. He would call my phone next. I knew he would. I could almost see the way his hands would shake as he pressed my name on the screen. But my phone was already off, tucked deep inside my jacket pocket as I sat miles away from that house, stirring my coffee and watching the sunlight crawl across the floor. I did not need to hear his voice. I already knew what it would sound like. First confusion, then anger. Then the hollow tone that comes after pride collapses into fear. The thought did not make me feel victorious. It did not bring satisfaction. What I felt instead was stillness, the kind that only comes after years of noise. I was not running away. I was simply done explaining myself to people who had stopped listening long ago. I finished my coffee, stood, and walked toward the train platform. The suitcase wheels clicked against the pavement, steady and final. When the train arrived, I found a seat by the window and placed my bag at my feet. As the train began to move, the city started to shrink, the buildings fading into the distance until they became nothing but gray outlines against the horizon. I watched the world slide past, the fields, the houses, the endless stretch of road, and thought about how strange freedom feels when you have spent a lifetime earning it through pain. For the first time in years, there was no destination waiting for me, just distance. I leaned my head against the window, listening to the rhythm of the tracks, and thought about Liam. Somewhere behind me, he was probably standing in that empty house, trying to make sense of what had happened, searching for answers that would never come. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he was finally beginning to understand that love and comfort are not rights. They are gifts, and once taken for granted, they disappear. As the train moved further away, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "It is over." When I opened them again, the world outside the window had changed. The city was gone, replaced by open fields and quiet stretches of countryside. The air inside the train felt different, cleaner somehow, as if the past had been left behind with every mile. I did not know exactly where I was going. I had no plan, no destination, only the desire to be somewhere that did not carry her laughter or his silence. I watched the landscape unfold, the colors shifting from gray to gold as the morning sun began to warm the earth. For the first time in years, I felt the faint stir of something I had forgotten existed. Peace. Hours later, I stepped off the train in a small coastal town I barely remembered reading about years ago. The station was old and half empty, its signs faded by salt and wind. The air smelled of seaweed and rain, sharp and honest. I carried my small suitcase through the narrow streets, past whitewashed houses with blue shutters, until I reached a modest inn overlooking the water. The woman at the counter smiled when I asked for a room. She did not ask where I came from or why I was there. She simply handed me a key and wished me a quiet stay. I thanked her, grateful for the kind of silence that does not need explanation. The room was small but clean. White walls, wooden floors, a single window facing the sea. I unpacked slowly, placing Grace's photograph on the nightstand, folding my shirts neatly into the drawer. When I finished, I stood by the window and looked out at the horizon. The sea stretched endlessly, its surface shifting between blue and silver under the changing light. The sound of waves breaking against the rocks below filled the air, steady and calm. I watched the water for a long time until the tension in my chest began to fade. There was a comfort in the ocean's indifference. It reminded me that life goes on, no matter who leaves or stays. Days turned into weeks. I started walking every morning along the shoreline, feeling the sand shift under my feet, the cold wind cutting through my coat. I watched fishermen repair their nets and children chase gulls near the tide. I spoke to no one. I answered to no one. In the evenings, I would sit by the window of my small room, listening to the waves and writing in my journal. I wrote not about Liam or Grace, but about the small details that filled the days, the sound of rain against the glass, the way sunlight turned the sea gold at sunset, the rhythm of the tides. It was a quiet life, one made up of small, unimportant moments. And yet it felt more real than anything I had lived before. There were nights, though, when sleep would not come. On those nights, I would light the small lamp by my bed and stare at Grace's photograph. She was smiling in that picture, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. I would whisper to her, telling her about the sea, the calm, the stillness, as if she could hear me. I often wondered what she would think of what I had done. Would she call it cruel or necessary? I liked to believe she would understand. She had always known that love could blind a person as easily as it could heal them. I had learned that truth too late, but at least I had learned it. One afternoon, months after I had arrived, I went for a walk farther down the coast than usual. The wind was strong that day, carrying the faint cry of seagulls across the water. The sky hung low and gray, and the waves crashed harder against the rocks. I found a flat stone to sit on and watched the horizon until the cold began to bite at my hands. There was a peace in the solitude, a rhythm in the sound of the tide that no human voice could match. For the first time in a long time, I was not haunted by memories. The past had finally grown quiet. When I returned to the inn later that evening, the innkeeper handed me an envelope. "This came for you," she said kindly. I looked at her, surprised. I had not given my name to anyone except her, and I had not told anyone where I was staying. The envelope was plain, my name written neatly on the front. The handwriting was not Liam's. I thanked her, took it upstairs, and sat by the window before opening it. Inside was a short letter, written by a neighbor from my old street. The words were simple, factual, but each one landed heavy. Liam had fallen apart. The house was gone, the money gone, the arrogance gone. What remained was a man learning too late what loss truly felt like. The letter ended with a single line that stayed in my mind long after I folded the paper. "He is not the same anymore." I sat there for a long time, staring at the folded letter on the table. Outside, the sea continued its endless rhythm, unbothered by human sorrow. I did not feel anger. I did not feel victory. What I felt was balance. The world, in its quiet way, had simply set things right. I rose from the chair, opened the window, and let the cold wind fill the room. The letter fluttered slightly under the breeze, the paper trembling as if alive. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to protect Liam from pain, believing it was love. Maybe this was the lesson neither of us had wanted, but both had needed. In the weeks that followed, the letter stayed folded on my nightstand, untouched but never forgotten. I would glance at it sometimes when the wind rattled the window or when the sea grew louder at night. It reminded me that distance did not erase history. It only softened it. I did not feel pride in what had happened, and I did not feel guilt either. What I felt was understanding, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting with the past. Liam was no longer my responsibility, and perhaps that was the most difficult truth I had ever accepted. The days in the coastal town slipped by quietly, marked by the rise and fall of the tides. I woke early each morning and walked along the shoreline, my footsteps disappearing almost as quickly as I made them. I learned to live without expectation, to take comfort in small things, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the creak of the wooden floor in my room, the sound of distant laughter from people whose lives would never cross mine. The silence that had once felt unbearable became my companion. It was not the silence of loss anymore. It was the silence of peace. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would sit on the rocks by the shore and watch the sky turn to gold before fading into blue. The waves would move in steady rhythm, endless and unconcerned. I would think about Grace then. I could almost hear her laugh carried by the wind, soft and fleeting. I wondered if somewhere beyond what I could see, she was watching all of this unfold, seeing how everything we built had come apart and yet somehow come full circle. I liked to believe she would understand why I did what I did. She had always known that love without respect eventually become servitude. And I had served long enough. The people in the town came to know me as the quiet man by the sea. They would nod when we crossed paths, offer bread, share a bottle of wine, but never ask too many questions. I was grateful for that. It was easier to be no one here, easier to exist without history, without expectation, without explanation. Sometimes, when I saw fathers walking with their sons along the docks, I would feel a familiar ache. But it was softer now, like an old scar that no longer hurt when touched. The pain had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something else: acceptance. Months turned into years. The seasons changed. My hair grew grayer, my hands slower, but the peace I had found remained constant. I learned that happiness is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, sitting in a chair by the sea with a cup of coffee and no one to answer to. I stopped counting time the way I used to. The clock no longer dictated my days. Instead, I measured life by the sound of the waves and the color of the sky. Every now and then, I would think of Liam, not as the man who had hurt me, but as the boy who had once fallen asleep on my shoulder, who had once trusted me completely. I no longer wished for his apology. I no longer needed his understanding. I hoped only that he had learned something from what happened, that he had finally realized love is not endless when taken for granted. Maybe one day he would understand that everything I did was not punishment, but release. One evening, as I sat by the window, the sea calm and silver beneath the fading light, I opened my journal for the first time in months. The pages were nearly filled now with fragments of thoughts, memories, and reflections. On the last blank page, I wrote slowly, my hand trembling slightly as the pen touched paper. Peace is not something you find in others. It is something you build in the ruins of what they leave behind. When I finished writing, I set the pen down and stared out the window. The horizon was endless, stretching far beyond what my eyes could reach. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. I thought about that night at the dinner table, about the words that had started it all. They no longer hurt the way they once did. They were part of the story now, a beginning disguised as an ending. Sometimes love ends not in shouting or in anger, but in a whisper, in the quiet act of letting go. I had finally let go. I leaned back in my chair, the sound of waves filling the room, and I smiled faintly to myself. He told me I was not his real father, so I stopped pretending he was my real son. If you like this story, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which country you are watching from and what you would have done in Thomas's place. To hear the next story, click on the box on your screen and your